Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm Sam Albanese from the National Weather Service. To start with the weather around the state today, there's two areas of concern as far as warnings go, or advisories. We still have the high wind warning in that Bering Strait region due to some strong southerly winds of about 65 miles an hour in the Savunga area. Then also up along the Arctic coast from Barrow to the west, we are expecting some freezing drizzle overnight tonight. West of Barrow, that should be ending by midnight, and in the Barrow area, it'll probably hang on until the early morning hours around 6 a.m. So those are some things to keep in mind. Taking a look at our breakup map, still looking like most of the rivers are pretty much mostly ice. You have the Tanana River that has some openings in it, and also the Yukon River. Actually, the Yukon River has closed ice in the upper part of the river, then some open areas, and then middle part of the river it's open. And generally speaking, it's been a orderly breakup this spring so far. Taking a look at the fire danger, basically what we're expecting is we continue to see high fire danger over the south central region, particularly as we continue to see these dry, warm conditions persist over the next several days. And then also along the Alaska range, that's also been relatively dry, and that has some high to extreme fire danger there on the north side of the range. All right, now taking a look at our satellite imagery, here's the satellite over the North Pacific. Put this satellite in motion and you can kind of see how, well, there we go, it's in motion. We have this southerly flow along this frontal boundary that basically, the main low pressure system is here in the north to northwest Bering Sea, with a front that extends all the way down through the Bering Strait down to the eastern Aleutians in that Unalaska area. And you can see how this moisture is just flowing up along this frontal boundary, but it's really not making a lot of headway inland over Alaska, except as you get a little bit further north, and mainly that moisture is in the form of only clouds. Looking over the mainland part of the state, as we put this in motion, you'll see that basically generally clear sunny conditions over the majority of southwest Alaska into the eastern interior, as well as portions of southeast Alaska, particularly from Juneau north. Cloud cover over that northwest part of the state. Run that loop one more time. Basically, you can see where our high pressure is. The clouds are going up over that ridge, and generally warm, sunny conditions over much of the mainland. Clouds didn't really show up on this infrared loop, but there were some areas of clouds in the visible imagery over the Gulf of Alaska. Taking a look at the surface map, high pressure in the Gulf up into the interior, as I was discussing in the satellite imagery. Generally clear, sunny conditions over much of the mainland, right on down into southwest Alaska and the northern half to third of the Panhandle. Southern southeast Alaska continued to see some rainfall throughout the day today. Cloud cover over much of the western portion of the state to the Arctic coast, and then in the Bering Strait, windy conditions and wet conditions there. Windy, wet conditions down through the Pribilof Islands and the eastern Aleutian Islands, and behind this frontal system and in the wraparound flow of this low pressure system, showery type weather across the Aleutian Islands as well as the central and western Bering Sea. Taking a look at the forecast for tonight, our low pressure system continues to move north. The frontal boundary basically stays from the Bering Strait down to the eastern to central Aleutian Islands. This will be our band of moisture right along this frontal boundary. Rain in the eastern to central Aleutian Islands, up through the Pribilof Islands, a mixture of rain and snow showers, just briefly mixed in the St. Lawrence Island area, rain showers in the Norton Sound area, rain and snow showers possibly into that Kotzebue Sound area, and then up along the Arctic coast from Barrow west, here's where we're expecting our freezing drizzle, but cloudy conditions and some snow as you get further west along the Arctic, further east along the Arctic coast. Clear, cool conditions across the mainland as the clear conditions during the day result in sunny conditions. Overnight you see radiational cooling and things cool down. Southeast Alaska, expect conditions to be clearing out in the northern portions of the Panhandle, rain persisting in the southern Panhandle. And another thing that's going to start to happen in Southeast Alaska is as this pressure gradient between the high and the low increases, we'll start to see an increase in those winds through the mountain gaps and passes. By Thursday, you can see the pressure gradient in Southeast Alaska is tightening up. Should start to see an increase in the winds, particularly up into the northern Panhandle. Sunny, warm conditions over much of the interior, right on up into the upper Yukon Valley, and then down across the state to southwest Alaska. Even the Alaska Peninsula should be seeing some sunny conditions by tomorrow. Cloudy conditions over the eastern Bering Sea. Some showers lingering in the St. Lawrence Island area through that Bering Strait in the form of rain and snow mixed early on, predominantly rain as you get later into the day and conditions warm up. Some rain showers over the eastern Aleutians and central Aleutian Islands, and cloudy conditions over much of the Bering Sea with a mixture of rain and snow showers out in the extreme western Aleutian Islands. Taking a look at the forecast now for Friday. Basically, high pressure over the Bristol Bay, eastern Bering Sea with a ridge on up into the Brooks Range, with the main high pressure area way over on into the not British Columbia, the Northwest Territories and the Yukon Territory. Low pressure coming up into just south of the Gulf of Alaska with this front swinging on up towards the Queen Charlotte Islands. Southeast Alaska, generally speaking, expect conditions to be predominantly cloudy in the southern Panhandle, clear and sunny and relatively windy in the northern Panhandle, especially in the channel-driven places near the mountains, which is pretty much most of the northern Panhandle. Clear, sunny conditions and warm conditions can be expected over south central Alaska, right on up into the eastern interior, across the Brooks Range to the Seward Peninsula, as well as southwest and western Alaska down to the Alaska Peninsula once again. Out into the Bering Sea with this trough lingering in the north central Bering Sea, a mixture of rain and snow showers is possible through the St. Lawrence Island area up into the Bering Strait. And along the Aleutian Islands, there's a chance that you may see a rain shower or two over the central and western Aleutian Islands, but generally speaking, expect a continuation of the cloudy conditions out there. Taking a look now at the forecast, the temperatures around the state today. Southeast Alaska, temperatures were on the mild side in the southern Panhandle, mid-40s to low 50s, up to near 60 as you get towards the Haines and Skagway area. In the 40s and 50s along the North Gulf Coast to the mid-50s further inland, 50s in the Tanana Valley, upper Yukon Valley, as well as moving on down towards southwestern Alaska in the low to mid-50s until you get right along the coast where the clouds were, and also the moderation in temperatures from the Bering Sea itself, mid-30s to low 40s there. Moving on up to the Arctic slope region, temperatures generally in the 20s and 30s across the Arctic coastal areas into the Brooks Range, right on down into Kotzebue Sound and the Norton Sound area. And then on the south side of Norton Sound, temperatures were poking into the 40s there, mid-30s across the St. Lawrence Island area. And then taking a look at southwestern Alaska, temperatures, as I was saying earlier, 40s along the coast, 50s in the Bristol Bay area, 40s across the Alaska Peninsula, the Pribilof Islands, as well as temperatures in the 40s across the Aleutian Islands. Out towards Shemya, temperatures were only up to about 37 degrees today. Forecast for tonight, expect southeast Alaska to see temperatures in the mid-40s in the southern Panhandle to the mid-30s to the north, near 30 at Yakutat. Temperatures along the North Gulf Coast dropping into the upper 30s to near 40, dropping down to freezing in the Copper River Basin. Temperatures moderating into the, or cooling into the 30s across much of southwestern Alaska to near 40 in the western interior. 30-degree readings predominantly over the eastern interior, and up along the Arctic coast, expect your temperatures generally to be in the 20s. Then back down towards the Alaska Peninsula, temperatures in the 30s, as well as in the Pribilof and the Aleutian Islands out into the western Aleutian Islands. Taking a look at our highs for tomorrow, expect 60-degree readings in the southern Panhandle with a mixture of 50s predominantly along the outer coastal areas, mid-60s up into the Haines Skagway area. The North Gulf Coast, south central Alaska, temperatures in the upper 50s to low 60s. The eastern interior temperatures are going to be rather warm, nosing up near 70 in that Fairbanks area, 60s to near 70 over the interior towards McGrath, 50s and 60s as we get closer to the Bering Sea coast to near 40 over Nunivak Island. The Alaska Peninsula, expect your temperatures to be in the mid-40s to upper 40s. Pribilof Islands right around 40, mid-40s over the eastern Aleutian Islands as well as the central Aleutian Islands, and temperatures only into the upper 30s over the western Aleutian Islands. Up along the Arctic coast, temperatures generally staying in the 30-degree range throughout much of that region from the Brooks Range north. Taking a look now at our flying weather for tomorrow, expect some marginal to IFR conditions over just offshore of the eastern Arctic coast, marginal conditions right on down to the Bering Strait where you can expect some IFR conditions across the St. Lawrence Island area, down through the Pribilof Islands with marginal conditions over the eastern Aleutian Islands as well as the central Aleutian Islands, and also expect some marginal conditions out into the western Aleutian Islands during the day tomorrow. For our passes, expect VFR conditions for Anaktuvik as well as Adigan Pass. Moving on down to the Alaska Range, VFR conditions for Lake Clark as well as Merrill Pass. Rainy Pass, expect VFR conditions there as well for tomorrow. And over towards Windy Pass, VFR conditions as well. Continuing along the Alaska Range, expect VFR conditions for Isabel Pass as well as Mentasta Pass, VFR conditions there. Portage Tahneta Pass, expect VFR conditions. VFR conditions for Portage Pass. And as we move on over to Southeast Alaska and Chilkoot and White Pass, expect VFR conditions. But the other thing to note with these passes is as we're going to start to see an increase in those outflow winds and maybe become a little bit turbulent in both those passes late in the day tomorrow. Taking a look at our freezing levels, Southeast Alaska, expect pretty warm high freezing levels, 10,000 feet in the southern panhandle up to about 6,000 feet as you get on up to the northern panhandle. Over the mainland part of the state, expect your freezing level generally to be increasing up to about 6,000 feet across the majority of the state. 4,000 feet as we move on down towards the Alaska Peninsula and over the Bering Strait region, 4,000 feet rapidly dropping down to 2,000 feet and then to the surface as we get over towards the Chukot's Peninsula. Some warm air aloft over the surface freezing levels between St. Lawrence and St. Matthew Island, freezing levels, warm air above that 2,000 to 4,000 foot layer. Excuse me. Along the Aleutian Islands, expect your freezing levels at 4,000 feet over much of the Aleutian Islands, dropping off to about 2,000 feet as you get over towards Shemya, and then eventually to the surface as we approach the Kamchatka Peninsula. For icing tomorrow, expect some light isolated moderate rime icing from your freezing level to about 14,000 feet over the eastern Aleutian Islands to the central Aleutian Islands, right on up through the Pribilof Islands, St. Lawrence Island region, through the Bering Strait, and just off the western Arctic coast. Also some light isolated moderate rime icing from your freezing level to about 14,000 feet over the western Aleutian Islands for the day tomorrow. Now we'll take a look at our jet stream. The jet stream is coming off of the Kamchatka Peninsula in northern Japan at about 75 knots, drops down south of this low, upper level low that's over the central Aleutian Island region at about 95 knots. Then we see the jet stream split. One branch goes on up through that eastern Bering Sea along that frontal boundary, 70 knots, accelerating on up to about 120 knots over the Bering Strait region, and then dropping off to about 80 knots as it moves on over the northern portion of the Yukon Territory. Now the southern branch of this jet goes down south of that low, south of the Gulf of Alaska at about 100 knots, dropping off to about 60 knots as it crosses the panhandle tomorrow. Taking a look at the 9,000 foot level winds, light winds over much of the interior, 25 knot winds offshore over southeast Alaska, 20 knot winds to 15 knot winds across the Alaska Peninsula, accelerated winds up through the Bering Strait around 35 knots as well as on the northwest Arctic coast. Over the Bering Sea itself, generally light winds over the eastern Aleutians and the eastern Bering Sea, increasing to about 30 to 35 knots as we move on over to the central Aleutian Island area. About 25 knot winds in the western Aleutians as well as 25 to 35 knot winds in the western Bering Sea. Down to the 3,000 foot level, 25 to 30 knot winds over the central to western Aleutian, eastern Aleutian Islands, 30 knot winds south of the chain with 10 knots to the north, 30 knot winds out over the western Aleutian Islands, 30 knot winds coming up through the eastern Bering Sea, accelerating to 35 to 40 knots as we move on up through the Bering Strait and the northwest Arctic coast, as well as just north of Barrow. Light winds over southwest Alaska, 20 knot winds across the western Alaska Peninsula. Light winds along that north Gulf Coast of around 15 knots, 10 knots or less over much of the interior, And then down into southeast Alaska, generally 15-knot winds, offshore winds at that 3,000-foot level, although you will need to watch out for highly localized channeled winds in the mountains. And then for turbulence tomorrow, expect some isolated moderate turbulence below the 3,000-foot level throughout southeast Alaska. And again, that's because of that channeling of the winds. And then over the eastern Aleutian Islands, some isolated moderate turbulence below 3,000 feet can be expected there. That wraps up this portion of the show. Enjoy this segment and come back for the marine forecast.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined again by Eric Stevens of GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Eric, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been talking about the complex gathering of information from satellites, looking down on the surface of the planet. And some of those orbits around the planet work for Alaska, and some of them don't. There's a lot of challenges with those. How can we get better imagery for the poles and specifically for Alaska?
Right. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting kind of satellite orbit that has potential to be real helpful for the high latitudes.
Okay.
Especially us here in Alaska. Canadians, Russians, Norwegians will all be interested in this. The satellites are not in orbit yet. Now the future is uncertain, but it's possible, and if this happens, it will be wonderful for Alaska. It's called the highly elliptical orbit.
Oh, that sounds
it's interesting. Yeah. And I think first, to help our discussion, we should get back to some of Kepler's laws and how do satellites work.
Sure.
Kepler's first law, an orbit of a planet around a sun or a weather satellite around the Earth is not necessarily a circle, it's an ellipse.
Okay.
And the highly elliptical orbit takes advantage of this aspect. We're going to put the Earth in one of the ellipse and then stretch one of the foci of the ellipse and then stretch that ellipse out real far to make it highly elliptical.
The foci is that bend part of the end of the ellipse. If you're going to stretch out a rubber band, that would be the center, kind of the stretchy part.
Yes.
Ends. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then Kepler's second law says that the closer something is to the thing that it's orbiting, the faster it goes.
Okay.
We see this in the solar system, that Mercury flies around the sun real fast. Jupiter, much slower. Jupiter's further away, it's slower. Mercury's closer in, it's faster. This happens with weather satellites too. Even satellites like the International Space Station, it's pretty close to the Earth. It goes around the Earth in only 90 minutes. That thing is moving. It's only 250 miles away. So how can we take advantage of these two aspects of Kepler's laws of motion to get better weather surveillance of Alaska? And this highly elliptical orbit is going to be the approach. So we have with us today our friendly planet Earth and our simulated satellite, the lid off of this salt shaker
like
here.
Sputnik there. Yeah.
Here it is. It's shiny, it's metal, it's space worthy. And what we want to be able to do is, could you have a satellite hover over the top of the world, up over Alaska? You can't really do that. Geostationary satellites have to be over the equator.
Okay.
So how could we almost solve this? And this is the tricky part. Maybe should we tilt the Earth over?
Focus on the pole. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, right?
So here we have the northern side of the planet, and we're going to trace out the orbit of a satellite with this salt shaker lid here. Now imagine a highly elliptical orbit. So let's put the Earth in one of the foci of the ellipse, and we'll have an imaginary foci out here. So the satellite will not go in a circle around the Earth, but will be in this long strung out ellipse. So the satellite will go...
Kind of like a racetrack.
Yes, there you go, like a racetrack. So it's an oval elliptical shape like that. And notice now that when the satellite's over here, we've got a nice view of the northern hemisphere around. There's Alaska, Russia, Canada, Greenland, all there. So that's the ellipse aspect of an orbit, Kepler's first law. The second law saying that when you're further away as a satellite, you go slower. And this we can take real advantage of. Because the way this orbit works, when the satellite goes over Antarctica here, it's going to be close to the Earth. It's going to be moving, whoosh, goes on by. And then as it comes out here, it will slow down. This increases what is known as the dwell time. The satellite will just hang here looking for hours at Alaska and the high Arctic. And then eventually it will come around and it will accelerate and whiz around the South Pole and then come back and hang here for a while because it's further away from the planet. It goes slower.
Yeah.
It has to. That's the laws of motion. And such like that, repeating.
Wow.
Now, the real important way to make this work is you have to have two satellites. So that
Okay.
while one is whipping around the pole, you've got the other one out here, and they work as a team. You could then get a series of images of Alaska that can be almost from a quasi constant frame of reference,
Right.
and you can loop them together to make movies. You can take a picture every 10 minutes, say, of Alaska, and then loop it, playing it at several frames a second. You could see the clouds whiz on by. You know, the Weather Channel, weather broadcasters in the lower 48 especially can show these movie loops from the geostationary satellites. In Alaska, we've never really been able to do that very well, especially in the higher, most northern parts of the state, because those geostationary satellites are over the equator. It's not a good view. And this highly elliptical orbit, whipping around the South Pole and then dwelling up here, would be a way for us to get that constant frame of reference and do really good weather surveillance over the Arctic, seeing where those storms are, where they're going. Nothing quite like a movie loop of the weather in time to really illustrate what's important, what's going on.
And compared to what we have right now, we just have small windows or snapshots of what's going on with the polar orbiters. We don't have that long range view that's looking top down to give us that complete motion picture that helps us understand so much of the atmosphere at this
There's
point.
so many different kinds of satellites. Each has their advantage. Each is important, and the highly elliptical orbit satellite will also fit into that scheme. And it's a nifty idea to solve an Alaskan challenge.
That's fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. And again, kind of a satellite dream of the future to come. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate the information. And if you'd like to learn more about what Eric does at GINA, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we invite you to visit the web address that you see on your screen there. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder.
Welcome back, and let's get started by taking a look at the marine forecast for southeast Alaska. Expect north winds to northeast winds throughout much of the inner channeled waters, 20 knots in the southern inside waters and the central inside waters to 30 knots up through that Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area. Southern outside waters, northeast winds across the length of it at 20 knots. Taking a look at the area for Friday. Expect winds in the southern panhandle. You're starting to see the effect east to southeast winds in the southern panhandle as that next system is approaching from the south, around 20 knots. 30 to 35 knot northerly winds coming out of the highly channeled terrain of the inside waters in the central and northern panhandle. Outside waters, southeast to east winds 20 to 25 knots to the south, 25 knots as we're just off the coast of Sitka there, and northeast winds 20 knots off of Yakutat. The south central region, very light winds throughout much of the area. Variable winds 10 knots from Prince William Sound to the North Gulf Coast, across the Barren Islands as well as throughout Cook Inlet, although some northerly winds at 10 knots in the northern portion of the inlet. And around Kodiak Island, variable winds to southwest winds around 10 knots or so. Not a lot of change for Friday. We're going to see a little bit of an increase in the winds up to about 15 knots, but generally speaking, very calm conditions for this entire region. 10 knots in the Sound, 15 knots along the North Gulf Coast to around Kodiak Island, as well as the Barren Islands and Cook Inlet, with lighter winds around 10 knots in that northern Cook Inlet region. Taking a look at the Alaska Peninsula for Thursday, expect your winds to be out of the southeast 20 knots, south of Coal Bay as well as on the north side of the peninsula. Variable winds 10 knots in the Bristol Bay area with northeast winds 15 knots south of the eastern Alaska Peninsula. By Friday, and I failed to change the date on the nameplate on that, but this is for Friday, expect your winds to be out of the east 20 knots south of the peninsula to southeast 20 knots on the north side. North winds 10 knots in that Bristol Bay area with north winds 15 knots south of the eastern Alaska Peninsula. Taking a look at the Aleutian Islands for Thursday, expect your winds to be out of the southeast to south 30 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands, as well as just west of that over the Nikolsky area, 25 knots there. Then east to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots as we move on out towards Atka and Adak. Variable winds 10 knots over the central Aleutian Islands to the Amchitka area, with winds out of the west at 25 knots over the Shemya area. By Friday, expect your winds out of the south 25 knots over the Shemya area, remaining variable 10 knots over the Amchitka area. Then expect your winds to be out of the east and southeast about 20 to 30 knots over the Adak to Atka area, 25 knot southeasterlies over the area just west of Nikolsky, with 25 to 30 knot southeasterly winds over the eastern Aleutian Islands near Unalaska. Taking a look at the Bering Sea coastal waters, expect your winds to be out of the southeast 25 knots across the Pribilof Islands to south winds 25 knots over St. Matthew Island and 35 knots as we get over the St. Lawrence Island region. South to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots in the Nunivak Island region. Taking a look at the area for Friday, I didn't have that slide there. Conditions do let down a bit on Friday over the western Bering Sea. Expect your winds to be quite a bit less there. Along the Arctic coastal region for Thursday, expect your winds to be out of the south at about 35 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound and just off of Cape Lisburne. 35 knot southerly winds over that Point Lay area with 20 knot southerly winds up by Barrow. And then southwest winds 15 knots by Prudhoe Bay to 10 knot westerly winds over towards Dead Horse. Taking a look at the area for Friday, expect your winds to drop off considerably. 30 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound to Cape Lisburne and the Point Lay area with 20 knot winds, not drop off but increase as we get further to the east here with 20 knot winds out of the southwest over Prudhoe Bay with west winds 20 knots over the eastern Arctic coastal region. And now we'll take a quick recap, taking a look at the surface map for tonight. Again, high pressure over the interior. We're going to see those gap winds over southeast Alaska, not as strong tonight and tomorrow as they will be Friday. Some rain in the southern panhandle. Our main area of concern is along this frontal boundary, rain to the south over the eastern Aleutian Islands with a mixture of rain and snow as we get on up through the Bering Strait region, and as well as the strong southerly winds there around 65 miles an hour near Savunga, and also expect some freezing rain possibly along the Arctic coast from Barrow west. Taking a look at the forecast again quickly for Thursday, high pressure and sunny conditions over much of the interior, but we're out of time for the show this evening. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.